Breaking news. Please stand by for another C2C World News Now current event. Hello, today is Saturday, and this is the 17th day of September 2016.
This is a C2C exclusive report concerning the Syrian ceasefire agreement that was bartered in favor of the Syrian government. With the cooperation between the United Nations, the United States, Russia and Syria, back on September 9th. The ceasefire was to take place starting on September 12th and should last for 7 days, according to the details written in the agreement. We will start by taking you back to the beginning when the ceasefire was signed and initially put into effect on September 12th. This may help you understand and make your own determination on who is the aggressor and whom is the ones trying to keep peace in this region. This is something we all should be worried about. Announced on September 12th around 1500 GMT time. Russia and the United States indicated that the brokered ceasefire deal for Syria has now come into effect.
In Moscow, this is RT International. I'm Sean Thomas. Glad to have you with us. We start with breaking news this hour. Russia and the United States have announced a plan to end the deadly conflict in Syria. Secretary of State John Kerry and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave a media briefing after marathon talks in Geneva. Our correspondent Igor Piskunov was there in the city, has more on the deal.
The official ceasefire started at 7 p.m. Damascus time, 1600 GMT time on Monday. Also announced was that Moscow and the United States will create a joint center to help with the difficulty of defining and identifying terrorist targets.
Daniel, hi there. It's a ceasefire that's been a long time in the making, and thus great hopes are placed on it lasting. Bring us up to spec with the actual details of it.
That's right, Yunan. It's been many weeks and months, some would say even years in the making, this fire. As you say, we're less than an hour into it, and it's due to last just over a week. So just one tiny step made into it so far, and so far all calm as far as we understand in Aleppo.
Announced in a story on September 13th around 1300 GMT time. U.S. officials offer mixed reactions to the newly brokered and effected Syrian ceasefire. U.S. stands ready to blame Russia, Assad for failures. Washington has continually expressed uncertainty throughout this deal at whether the Syrian ceasefire will work or not. The State Department is cautiously optimistic, while the White House wants more assurances from Russia. Meanwhile, the Pentagon appears skeptical. The United States is not willing to give up control in Syria. But if the ceasefire goes south, it will blame Russia for not controlling Syrian President Bashar Assad. On the other hand, the Russians say that if the ceasefire falls apart, it will be the Americans' fault for not controlling the opposition. Both sides blame the other for the failures of previous ceasefire attempts.
The countdown for the cessation of hostilities to begin is almost up. Many people in Aleppo, after so many failed efforts, are very skeptical about whether it's actually going to work. 23-year-old Ella lives here on one of the old city's front lines. We've come to talk to her about what an end to the violence will mean for her. Ella, do you believe that this cessation of hostilities is genuinely going to work this time?
Every time we hear about a truce, the fighting just continues. We hope to have at least one peaceful night, but it is not happening. Of course, the ceasefire would be useful. At least we will be able to have a few days without bloodshed. Every morning we wake up to gunfire and the sound of shelling. It is terrifying. I have two brothers who are martyrs. One was 27 and the other 16. My sister's husband became a martyr. He was killed during Ramadan. Life is hard here, but we are staying for the sake of our homeland and the president and the martyrs. What else can we do? My hope is to live in a peaceful country where the next generation can study and have everything they need and not live as we are living.
reported by the Russian military on September 13 around 2100 GMT time. The so-called moderate rebel forces in Syria have violated the nationwide ceasefire on 23 occasions since it was put in place on Monday. 6 people died in Aleppo overnight while 10 others have been wounded. The Syrian government is abiding by the ceasefire, Russian General Staff official Viktor Paznikir said. Syrian government forces have completely stopped their shelling, except for the areas occupied by ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra militants. Unfortunately, that can't be said about the armed forces of the moderate opposition that are backed by the United States. US-backed rebel forces have shelled residential areas as well as Syrian army positions, according to the Russian General Staff. 6 people died on Monday night following the shelling of Aleppo by the moderate opposition forces, with 10 others receiving injuries. Colonel Sergei Kapitsin from the Russian Reconciliation Center in Syria said Tuesday. 5 violations of the cessation of hostilities by the moderate opposition in the city of Aleppo, which killed 6 and injured 10 people, were registered overnight following the introduction of the ceasefire, Kapitsin said. As well, late on Monday, positions of the Republican Guard of the Syrian army were targeted by sniper fire in Aleppo. Mortar fire has also hit residential areas in the district of Al-Ansari, while positions of the Syrian military in the same district were targeted by guided anti-tank missiles, according to the Russian military. On September 15 around 1700 GMT time, Russia announces they have launched a live aerial drone to watch the ceasefire in Syria. According to Russia, Russian forces are using the most advanced ASNOK mobile radar system to monitor the situation in the region. The system is designed for artillery and missile launch site reconnaissance, shell trajectory calculation, as well as airspace monitoring. It can detect artillery and mortar fire as well as moving ground targets at a distance of 5 kilometers. The ministry's statement comes a day after the United States and Russia agreed to extend the ceasefire in Syria for another 2 days. Earlier, the Russian General Staff also called for extending the truce, although it reported a significant number of violations by various militant groups. Reported on September around 2100 GMT time, the US and Russia said that the recently negotiated ceasefire regime in Syria is still holding. Despite numerous violations by various militant groups, all parties involved agreed to extend it for a further 3 days. Speaking at a briefing Friday, senior Russian General Staff official Viktor Paznikir said, the Syrian government forces were first to withdraw from the strategic Castello Road into Aleppo under the latest US-Russian agreement on Syria. However, they had to return to their positions after being shelled by rebels, he added. On the Castello Road, all governmental forces have pulled back tanks, armored personnel carriers and artillery, all to an agreed distance to create a demilitarized zone. However, current radar images and visual observation also show that opposition groups did not withdraw from the road. The Castello Road should serve as a humanitarian corridor to deliver much-needed UN aid to civilians still trapped in the besieged city and the neighboring regions. So far, only 4 days into the ceasefire, the regime has been violated by the opposition forces 39 times over the last 24 hours. Currently bringing the total number of truce violations to 144 since this latest ceasefire came into effect. The number of ceasefire violations by the Syrian opposition is consistently growing. All the while, the U.S. still takes no measures to make opposition forces under its control observe the ceasefire regime. So far it appears that Russia and the Syrian army have fully fulfilled their obligations and continue to try and maintain a proper ceasefire agreement. Meanwhile, the Russian General Staff said that Russia is ready to extend the ceasefire regime for a further 72 hours, despite numerous violations by the Syrian opposition. Russian military officials in Geneva once again emphasized that the need for the United States to provide data allowing Russia to distinguish between positions held by the opposition and those taken by terrorists. Friday, U.S. State Secretary John Kerry said that the United States will not establish the joint U.S.-Russian Coordination Center. He reiterated that this would not start until humanitarian aid is delivered to the city of Aleppo and other areas. Reported by Russian military on September 17, around 0900 GMT time. Terrorist groups, which Russia expected to be separated from the moderate rebels along with the help of the United States, all in hopes it would make them susceptible to further future joint United States and Russian attacks. Instead, the groups are using the ongoing ceasefire to strategically regroup and resupply. Moscow remains hopeful that this attempt at reconciliation in Syria will eventually succeed. Russians are more positive than negative and expect that the promises, which the United States administration made to us, would be delivered. The two nations are also at odds over another key issue. Moscow says it wants the terms of the United States-Russian deal to be made public and endorsed in a UN Security Council resolution. Washington insists that the terms should remain classified, saying that otherwise the truce could be derailed. As of September 17 and reported around 1500 GMT time, the U.S. is still reluctant to take measures to force rebels under its control to implement the Syrian ceasefire. If these practices continue and if things do not change, Washington will appear to be the sole side responsible for the failure of the truce. After 5 days of the ceasefire, it has to be noted that only the Russian and Syrian sides have been fully implementing their commitments. On its own initiative, Russia prolonged the cessation of hostilities for 48 hours, and yesterday it was extended for another 72 hours. But it is very different on the American side as the United States and the so-called moderate groups under their control have yet to fulfill a single commitment undertaken in the framework of the Geneva arrangements. The main priority of the Russian-American agreements of September was the division of territories controlled by ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the areas controlled by the so-called moderate opposition, as well as the separation of the moderate opposition from Jabhat al-Nusra. Such a division is essential for the implementation of the ceasefire in Syria because, without it, the hands of the government forces are tied. They can't fight the terrorists without knowing which of them joined the truce and who didn't. Numerous Russian appeals to the American side remain unanswered, which raises doubts over the United States' ability to influence their very own opposition groups that remain under their control. In the past 24 hours, the number of attacks has increased drastically. The positions of government troops, the people's militia, and civilians were fired at on 55 occasions. The FM also called on the American side to actively participate in monitoring the Syrian ceasefire instead of merely accusing Syrian government forces of violations. Russian spokesman also stressed, as a result of Russia's efforts, the issues of putting on track cooperation between the Syrian authorities and the United Nations in the area of broader humanitarian access are being solved, though not without difficulty. Now reported on September 17, around 1700 GMT time, United States-led coalition jets have bombed Syrian government forces positions near the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor. The bombings have resulted in killing 62 Syrian forces troops and now paving the way for Islamic State militants.
Also confirmed that the US-led coalition has carried out 4 airstrikes in the area of Deir ez-Zor, that's in the east of Syria, killing 62 soldiers and injuring around 100 others. 2 F-16 fighters, 2 A-10 jets allegedly entered from the side of Iraq. That's according to the ministry. The Pentagon, however, hasn't yet commented on those accusations.
The bombing took place on Al-Farda mountain, in the region of Deir ez-Zor. The attacks caused major casualties and destruction on the ground. 62 Syrian soldiers were killed, and preliminary reports indicate over 100 injured by the airstrike that was executed by the United States-led coalition. Citing information received from the Syrian General Command, it's been reported that the aircraft which carried out the bombings have entered Syrian airspace from the territory of Iraq. The Syrian General Command has called the bombing a serious and blatant aggression against Syrian forces. He also continued saying that it was conclusive evidence that the United States and its allies support ISIS militants. Earlier on Saturday, Russia accused the U.S. of being reluctant to take measures to force rebels under its control to fall in line with the terms of the Syrian ceasefire. Most recent news released concerning this matter in Syria was released today, September 17, around 1900 GMT time. Headlines read as follows: United States is defending ISIS. Russia convenes United Nations Security Council meeting after United States coalition strike on Syrian army. Moscow has now called an urgent United Nations Security Council meeting after the United States-led coalition hit Syrian forces, killing 62 soldiers and wounding 100 more. The Russian FM spokeswoman blasted Washington over the indiscriminate airstrike that she said serves the interests of ISIS terrorists. If previously we had suspicions that al-Nusra Front is protected this way, now, after today's airstrikes on the Syrian army, we come to a really terrifying conclusion for the entire world. The White House is defending IS, Islamic State, formerly known as ISIL. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova told Rossiya 24. We demand a full and detailed explanation from Washington. That explanation must be given at the UN Security Council. The Foreign Ministry has demanded a full and detailed explanation from Washington over the incident in Deir ez-Zor. Moscow stressed that it is concerned by the United States airstrike targeting the Syrian army units, which had been destroying Islamic State ISIS militants. The ministry added that the Russian side had not, nor had they ever been notified, of the United States' plans to carry out bombings in the Deir ez-Zor area. Immediately after the airstrike by coalition planes, Islamic State militants launched their offensive. He added that the Russian Air Force intervened immediately to halt terrorist advances. According to the reports from the Russian Air Force, they have had to conduct at least 10 airstrikes on Islamist positions since 7 p.m. local time. Confirmed by the Syrian Minister of Defense Fahd Jassim al-Faraj. It is only because of the Russian Air Force support that the offensive of the terrorist group was stopped. We request that the air support for the Syrian armed forces be continued by the Russian Air Force in order to destroy the terrorists. The Russian Foreign Ministry stressed that United States airstrikes against the Syrian government forces jeopardized the Syrian ceasefire deal reached between Moscow and Washington on September 9. United States Central Command later issued a statement saying that the U.S.-led coalition would not intentionally strike a known Syrian military unit. However, an unnamed U.S. military official told Reuters that he was pretty sure that the targets hit in United States-led coalition airstrike on Saturday had been Syrian forces. According to the official, the bombings in Deir ez-Zor were carried out using United States intelligence, which was being gathered for days. The U.S. attack stopped as soon as Russia notified the American side that they had been hitting the Syrian military, the source added. The United States has also just released a statement. The United States has relayed its regrets to Syria for the unintentional loss of life resulting from airstrikes in eastern Syria.
This has been a C2C World News Now current event. Stay safe, everyone.